My third point has been that geopolitics is wrongly dismissed as the problem when in fact it is or can be the solution. We have an escape from geopolitics mentality. We have a fear of the return of geopolitics. For the right, that is to say, people who consider themselves conservative, they are above geopolitics. There's a kind of pure American hegemony. For the left, geopolitics is so evil that it must be transcended with pooled sovereignty and multinational institutions. These are not only wrong, they're not only mistakes, but they're politically dangerous views. Because we got to where we were through geopolitics. The Cold War was won because of geopolitics. The world was built because of geopolitics, and it will be sustained only because geopolitics is our friend. So this is the China Greater Eurasia. Does it look different from that little piece of Crimea, right? Donetsk and Lugansk, Transnistria. Does it look a little bit different, China Greater Eurasia? It looks different to me, and there's a sea version of it too, right? You see Djibouti, you see the Straits. Yeah, this is the China version. So it's a very different situation with China. We're not talking about a country that is in the self-perpetuated decline, which is what Russia is right now. Self-destruction, which is what Russia is in right now. We're talking about a country that has ambitions. This I showed the first lecture, you'll recall. These are ports abroad where China owns a significant ownership stake. China's merchant marine is 200,000 ships. $200,000 ships. And these are the ports where they have a significant, in many cases, more than 51% interest. You'll notice that it looks a lot like the British Empire, doesn't it? Yeah. Sphere of influence, emulation. This map are the ports which are so-called dual use. That's where you start with trade and you decide to build a military. You start with trade and you say, yes, we come in peace. We have no hostile intentions. We only want to trade and raise your economy up. And then you have a toehold, you have a port, and then you say, you know what? We will need to defend our trade. We want to make sure that nobody interdicts our trade. Nobody tries to undo our global trade. So we're going to defend them. And we're going to build, as they've done in Gwadar, Djibouti, and next potentially Piraeus, right? We're going to start calling there with our Navy. And we're going to create dual use, commercial and military, with the ports. So you go back to this. This is already there. And this is the beginning of the dual use. So that's Chinese grand strategy. Yeah. And I got to tell you, they're very serious about it. This is, I showed the first lecture, right? The percentage of world trade. Look at this. U.S. percentage of world trade. This is the British Empire. They created the world economy. This is the U.S. eclipse of the British Empire. You can see already in 1900, look out, right? Before the British Empire. In fact, the British Empire is going to grow to its biggest height after that, after 1900, in the interwar period. And now look at China, and look how recent that is. And look at the trajectory, right? The sharpness. That's what we're dealing with, Chinese sphere of influence question. China has 20 neighbors, as we discussed in the first lecture. It's got more neighbors, 14 on land and 6 on sea, than any other country ever. It has more neighbors than Russia has. It has more neighbors than the Soviet Union had. So it's got borders with 20 countries, and it's in dispute with those countries in many cases. We talked about the South China Sea, and I showed you the military base that they built, right, on Fiery Cross Reef. You'll remember the picture. It was a coral reef in 2014, and in 2016 it had a 10,000, right, foot runway for military ships. Okay, but the other thing you see from this map is that China has no California. That's the single biggest problem, geopolitical problem of China. On the one hand, they're boxed in, right? They have US military bases all around their seaports, right? The US has bases all up and down. Japan is basically a US aircraft carrier, right? Philippines has US bases. And so they're boxed in, even where they have water, and then they have no California. Instead, this is what they've got. You see this? You see what this is? This is farmland. This is desert. This is encroaching desert. This is what China's west looks like. That desert is moving, and it's eating and eating the farmland. So if you go back here, this is all desert, and this desert is going this way. That's their California. That's a really big problem. If everybody in China drinks an extra glass of water every day, this thing heads for Beijing. Right? That's their ecological challenge. This is very serious. Look at that. That's sand, and it's on the move. Okay, they have no California, but guess what? They're building a California. Here's Gwadar. We talked about a dual-use port, originally commercial, now also military. And you can see the Chinese built infrastructure right through Pakistan onto the ocean. Here's the same story, but in Burma. Also, you build a gas pipeline, right? It's for commercial reasons. And then we have an outlet to the Bay of Bengal. And they can play a long game. If the Burmese government stops the infrastructure for a time because they feel the Chinese grip is too tight, the Chinese know they'll be around for a while and they'll be able to resume. The problem with their California is it has to go through Pakistan and it has to go through Burma. You see, the United States California just goes through California. It's a whole lot easier to have a California that you own and that doesn't go through potentially difficult places like Pakistan and Burma. Nothing to take away from Pakistan and Burma, but it's a much bigger challenge for that to be your western coast, for that to be your port, than for California to be your western coast. Then you have the roiling East Asia problem. World War II, it's not over yet in East Asia. It didn't end. The Cold War, it's not over yet in East Asia. This is a big problem. There is tremendous roiling historical grievance. Tremendous grievance over the war, which is unsettled. And it's the kind of grievance that's as great or greater than we saw in interwar Europe, the grievances over World War I. You know how those grievances were manipulated. We got grievances at least as deep, and in many cases, significantly deeper. And they're right there, not below the surface. They're right there in the societies, on their media all the time. So we have a combustible narrative, victim of humiliation in the past, and adversaries trying to hold it down in the present. Right? This is the resentment. This is the resentment. Now, I won't go into detail about where, can China get better? Is China getting better? Right? How resilient is China? What happens when there's a crisis? I could talk all about the challenges in China. This is the main one, right? We focus on Tibet and Xinjiang because they have the ethnic strife there, but the big ones are Hong Kong, Taiwan, because those are alternative political models, right? So you have Manchuria and Inner Mongolia are gone. They've been overrun by Han Chinese. Outer Mongolia is currently independent. Tibet and Xinjiang are being assimilated forcibly by China with the ethnic strife, but it's very hard to assimilate the Hong Kong and the Taiwan because it's an alternative political model. This is the deepest threat to the Chinese political system. They want to bring them in, and with Hong Kong, they've already done that in a partial way, and they would love to do it with Taiwan, but it's not a simple proposition for them. That's bigger than the ecological challenge, which is big enough. Okay, right? And we can have miscalculation. There are many ways that China could have an explosion or an implosion. Many weaknesses, many issues, right? But even if there are no shocks, there's slower economic growth, there's corrosive corruption, there's demographic and environmental stress, and there's inability to stabilize the political system enduringly. That's without the shocks, that's where they are, right? So this is not an easy situation by any stretch of the imagination. What the Chinese Communist Party leadership faces are challenges significantly greater than anything they've dealt with up till now. What do the experts on China say? Right? They say that China becomes aggressive when it feels strong, and that it becomes aggressive when it feels weak. That's what the literature says. Right? We don't know about the decision-making process. This is the first time in history that a country has been this wealthy with this opaque a political system. Because opaque political systems smother wealth. They don't create wealth. But the Chinese system is completely opaque and the second largest economy in the world. It's something that we haven't confronted before. We can't see inside their decision-making process. Right? So Chinese intentions are not understood. And of course, US actions are unpredictable. Because what's the single biggest variable of all? United States actions or inactions. China is no substitute for US power. We talked about the first lecture, how you measure power and what the measuring of the two side by side are, and I attempted to show that there's no way that China measures up anywhere near US power on any parameter whatsoever, right? It cannot replace the US to underwrite the international order. It cannot, and China knows this, right? Let alone the fact that a leader of any open system must itself be open. But openness is potentially the killer threat to the Chinese regime. So here's the strange thing. China, too, is nervous about the US possibly withdrawing from the liberal international order. China is dead set on gaining dominance in East Asia. And that means evicting or pushing out the US past the first island chain out to the second island chain. But nonetheless, China does not want to overturn the international order because they are the prime beneficiaries besides the US and the EU. China, in any case, lacks the capacity, let alone the desire, to underwrite a global international order. So if you look at the threats, where are they? Is Russia a threat to overturn the international order and put something in its place? Is even China, with its colossal sphere of influence emulation of the British Empire, is it even a threat to overturn the US sphere of influence, the Western, liberal, international, rules-based international order? No, that's not the threat. That's not the threat. Communism couldn't be brought down from without, and the US-based power in the world cannot be brought down from the outside either. It can, however, as in the case of communism, be brought down from the inside. That's the threat. The threat is the same resentment, the same populist politics in international terms at the level, right, of the international system, but coming out of Washington, not coming out of Beijing or not coming out of Moscow. That's the world we live in today. So we have this big problem. The U.S. provides security in all the key regions because it denies hegemony, it denies predominance to any one country in the key regions. You don't think that's hard? That's really hard, and that's really costly. That costs a lot. I'm a taxpayer in the U.S. I'm paying for this. The U.S. promotes an open market-based economic order. You don't think that's brought prosperity? It has brought prosperity. Not evenly, because markets never bring even prosperity. Never. But the absence of markets, we know what that brings. The multinational institutions, who helped create them and who's helped sustain them? So this is the liberal international order. The central fact about international politics is anarchy. It's not somebody being in charge. Somebody being in charge is rare because it's very costly to that country to be in charge. And because it's very difficult to manage, to have the kind of power that stretches. And so the alternative is not a U.S. order that makes mistake after mistake, that's worthy of the criticism that we level at it. But the alternative is, you guessed it, anarchy. That's where we could be. Not a Chinese displacement of the U.S., not a blundering, self-interested U.S. order, U.S.-led international sphere of influence, but something very different. That's where we're close. We're not there yet, but that's potentially where we've been heading prior to Trump. We have fateful choices from Washington. Can American primacy preserved or restored? Should it be? Do we keep everything that we've got, or do we just let it go? You see, because we live in a democracy. And in a democracy, you have to have the people support this. Because if the people don't support it, then it's only a briefing in a think tank. Brilliant briefings in think tanks about how U.S. grand strategy should look are different from something rooted in a democratic polity that a majority of people will approve, because it speaks to national interest, nationalism, right? Okay. Accommodation of China in East Asia, Russia in Eurasia, Iran in the Gulf. You want to just grant those sphere of influences and retreat? That's certainly a possibility, right? That doesn't mean a displacement. None of these are capable or interested in running an international rules-based order. Or do we end up then fighting a gigantic containment, maybe even bigger than the Soviet containment? Are the American people going to even get behind something like that over a long period, enduringly? There's got to be a new equilibrium somehow in which we recognize other states' interests, but we uphold core values. There's got to be. Otherwise, the thing doesn't last. Right? And so we have these patterns that we create which become laws. Patterns are not laws. Patterns are what you learn from history. But history doesn't necessarily repeat itself. History is open, as long as you understand the structural forces at work, right? War comes from miscalculation. It comes from miscalculating risks, miscalculating benefits or costs, right? War is not an accident. It's a miscalculation. People talk about how everyone stumbled into World War I, right? Barbara Tuchman. And then we had Christopher Clark wrote this fantastic rewrite of Barbara Tuchman with more stuff on the Austrians and the Serbs. But it's the same argument, sleepwalkers, right? Here's the problem with sleepwalkers. Just to move the horses, just to move the fodder that the horses ate took more than 1,000 orders from the Kaiser's office. So you don't sleepwalk into war when you have to send 1,000 orders that you sign just to move the food for the horses, correct? So it's not sleepwalking, it's miscalculation. It's a decision. It's a decision that elites make. The problem is the narrowness of the decision-making apparatus, right? One person, Xi Jinping, 2 people, 6 people can make these momentous decisions. Here we sit in Europe, and Donald Trump could bring the world to war. He's not consulting us. He's not asking, geez, what if I go to war? Would that be okay? Would you guys be good with that? Right? So that's the problem. We have the problem that decision makers can get us to war. But that's also not a given. And just because China is rising in a US-dominated world doesn't mean that China has to be stupid and the US has to be stupid. They can instead cooperate. Right? There has been nothing more important to China's success than the US. The US is the single biggest factor to China's success. Remember I talked about there's a sphere of influence of the West, and it's in East Asia too? And how Deng Xiaoping was looking at Japan, and it had been crushed in World War II and was in the ashes, and it rose to become the 2nd largest economy in the world. And then the same thing happened with South Korea, and the same thing happened with Taiwan. And Deng Xiaoping looked at this and said, how did this happen? And it happened because they were partners with whom? Partners with the United States. And they sold manufacturing goods into the US market. And China made that strategic choice when Deng Xiaoping came to the US in '79. It changed from the Soviet Union as its sphere of influence to the US. And it was able competitively to make goods to sell into the US market, what Eastern Europe was never able to do. One of the reasons why Eastern Europe failed in the 70s and 80s was East Asia was successful. The East Germans, the Romanians, they had nothing to sell. The Chinese would eventually have something to sell, but the Japanese, the South Koreans, and the Taiwanese had plenty to sell. And in a competitive marketplace, you have to win, the consumer, right? So what we have there, right, what we have there is China rising because of a de facto partnership with the US. Who guaranteed the security? Who guaranteed the open institutions? Who created and brought China into the WTO, right? You could go on and you could go on. You can't imagine China today without US power. You can't imagine it, right? And the Chinese are not stupid. They understand this. The problem is the potential for miscalculation. Evicting the US past the first island chain, past the second, East Asia has a first island chain, has a second. I didn't put that map on, I'm sorry, but I should have put that map now that I see I'm talking about it so much. But, move the US fleet out way beyond Chinese territorial waters and dominate East Asia. That they want to do, but without, as I said, giving up the US-based liberal rules, the rules-based order, right? And so that's the calculation they have to make. And then we have to make a similar calculation on our side, which is to say, how much of China's rise is okay by us, and how much of China's rise is a problem for us, right? That's negotiation and diplomacy, not only military. The challenge is that China is an opaque political system. And there's a lack of confidence over the long term in dealing with an authoritarian regime that's very powerful. The US feels very uncomfortable being in partnerships, having a system depend on authoritarian regimes. And the Chinese communists, right, their regime is the whole game for them. So this is where the miscalculation can come in on both sides. But no, it's not inevitable. And Joe Nye is a fantastic, amazing scholar. So what have I said in 3 days? What have I actually said? What's the takeaway message here over 3 days? The takeaway message is that the Western sphere of influence is a stunning achievement and needs to be preserved, but is in a decline, a self-started, right, self-initiated structural decline. Not an end, not a collapse, not a Soviet scenario, but there are problems with the West that the West itself has been doing to itself. Not Russia, not China. The China story is a remarkable story. It's an incredible story. And I hope it continues. I hope they have even more success. I'm very impressed with what they've been able to do, and I would never sell them short. even though I listed their problems. But they cannot substitute for the U.S. So they're not going to displace the U.S. in that sense. The U.S. is either going to displace itself, and we get to the anarchy, or the U.S. is not going to displace itself. We don't know the answer to that question, just like we don't know the answer to what the EU is going to look like next year and the year after, because that's up to us, right? That's up to us as publics and as our political entrepreneurs. It's wide open and possible. The U.S. has done many bad things, including to itself, and it's come out the other side even stronger. I remember the 70s, that's where these lectures began. If you were alive in the 70s and the mid-70s, would you have predicted the success that followed? Watergate, Vietnam, oil shock, right? There's a resilience. There's a tremendous resilience in the Western sphere of influence. There's tremendous resilience in Europe and tremendous resilience in the U.S. system. And Trump is not up to the task of massive destruction. Moreover, Trump didn't start the problem. He's a symptom. He can add to the problem. He can worsen the West's loss of will, loss of understanding of what it is, inability to take advantage of its strengths, fear, tremendous fear of threats that are blown way out of proportion. He can exacerbate all of that. So far, it's very early. You know, we're 100 days in. There's 1,364 days to go of the Trump administration. So it's kind of early to write. Do you know what the Clinton administration was like its first year? I got to tell you, it was not very competent. A guy from Arkansas didn't know much about the world and about running the free world when he came to power. George Bush from Texas, Barack Obama, from what? What did he do before he got to Washington? Nothing. No significant accomplishments whatsoever, right? So we're early in this game, and Trump looks more unqualified than everybody else because he's got character issues that are fundamental. He's fundamentally dishonest in a way that none of these other people were. And the character issue is gigantic as a variable in decision making, right?
Actually, he's terribly intelligent, as he says himself.
Yeah, you know, we could talk, unfortunately, a lot about that, but I just want to, I don't want these lectures to end and the main point is obscured because I failed to state it properly, right? So the main point is it's early, it's not collapse, we're not at anarchy yet, there's tremendous resilience. We don't know how much resilience there is in the Chinese system because they haven't experienced a significant crisis yet. We're on the other side of 2008 financial crisis, and there was a lot more resilience in the global financial system than people understood there to be. In fact, the Chinese and the Russians thought the U.S. was toast after that financial crisis. They wrote about it internally and they miscalculated because there's a resilience in Western societies. There's a resilience in democracy. There's a resilience in rule of law. There's a resilience in the Federal Reserve, which is a competent organization and which in fact runs the world economy, whether you like it or not, right? It's not a democratic institution. So this resilience is there. The structural issues, the self-defeat is gaining momentum, but it's very early. It's not the end of the world. Trump could have little effect on it. I don't think he could reverse it because he doesn't even understand these questions, right? Which is not to say, like I said, that his predecessors understood them that well. Barack Obama figured out that the world was changing, that China's power was rising, and that the U.S. couldn't impose its will everywhere anymore. And the result of that was to do next to nothing. But that recognition was a profound recognition. But we needed a proactive version. Once you recognize that, what are you going to do? Because omission can sometimes be as bad as commission, right? Everybody sees Bush commission Iraq War. People don't see omission the same way. So I'm not a pessimist. The U.S. is not a fundamentally revisionist power. The U.S. is undergoing a process whereby it's got to redefine how it is beneficial to America, to Americans, how it's nationalist to defend a global, open, rules-based international order. Thank you.